Good morning, everyone. Our next presenter is Dr. Mark Blackburn, who is a CERC Research Council member and senior research scientist from Stevens Institute of Technology. He's a thought leader and practitioner of systems engineering and more specifically model-based engineering. For the sake of brevity, I'll stop there as he'll be presenting updates on CERC research tasks WRT-1036 and ART-002, transforming systems engineering through model-centric engineering, phase 7. With that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Blackburn.
Thank you, Jan. So let me just get going right into it. So we're going to talk about some tools here, and we just want to state that it is not it's not necessarily an endorsement by our sponsors or our institutes. Systems engineering is a team sport, and we've been doing this for quite a while. We started with the NavAir folks back in 2013, and so there's been a lot of collaborators that have been involved, and not only just for the ART-002, which is the Army, but also for basically the Navy. So again, kudos to a lot of our collaborators on these things. So let me get back into it. So back in 2013, a gentleman, Mr. David Cohen, who has since retired from NavAir, said it was taking too long for things to actually go through the process. They had set up a very rigorous process for doing reviews, but it was taking them a very long time. So the project started out by looking at doing a global scan of all of industry, the best. And so we basically talked to over 30 individuals. We had 21 companies that we visited with our sponsors. And we said, tell us the most holistic approach that you've used to model-centric engineering, based engineering, model-based enterprise. And it expanded as we went on because we gathered more information. And with that, they brought in the best and the brightest. So we heard the best stories. So in late 2015, the leadership at NavAir said, we have to actually transform, not just evolve, to be able to provide effective oversight on the industry who is actually rapidly advancing the way that they're using technologies. And so that started with a digital engineering pilot called Skyzer, which I'll talk about in a minute here. And I'm first going to actually show a little bit of a correlation. So for any of you that were in the prior talk with Tom, we actually did a little effort with him related to this Skyzer. But the Skyzer pilot, it was an evolving pilot that went on for like three different years, basically, and I'm going to talk about those. One of the things is we demonstrated the art of possible in modeling everything. And with that, we established and have evidence. Now, what we're talking about here, it's not planned, it's not strategy, it's actually been implemented. We've created over 23 models and we're trying to get them to be releasable from a distro A point of view, but we demonstrate what it means to be an authoritative source of truth. We built a full stack of technical models from mission model, system model, multi-physics models, graphical ConOps, using reference architectures. We'll talk about how we can link stakeholder analysis models, such as cost or airworthiness, to the full stack of technical models. And I'll give a little plug tomorrow that we're going to actually have a 2-hour tutorial on our cost modeling. We're going to deep dive that with our subject matter expert, Don Allen from NavAir, and then we're going to also have a demonstration by one of our collaborators, Taylor Fields from Georgia Tech, at the end of that. So we'll be able to walk through the models, talk about the different kinds of things so that you can see what was really done. We also will continue today to talk about the importance of modeling methods going beyond processes, because they provide a means for using digital sign-offs, and that is embedding the actual sign-off directly in the model. And another goal of Mr. Cohen's was to eliminate CDRLs, is what he said. So CDRL is a contract data requirements list. It's the documents that are returned to you. What we've been able to do is to actually embed the digital sign-off in the actual model so that it could actually replace or transform the way CDRLs are done. Another pilot that we had done, which was a cyber ontology pilot, which actually shows how to actually use SysML models with ontologies and reason about different kinds of things. That is unclassified distro A. I'm not going to talk about it anymore today, but there are some videos out there if you want to actually see how that worked. And then how well has this been going? Well, we're actually taking these models called Skyzer models, and again, they're being used to support workforce development and demonstrate the art of the possible, because engineers and others actually learn a lot from the models, from examples. So with Skyzer, We started this again, it's late 2017. We used the search and rescue concept because of the hurricane that had hit Puerto Rico. And Mr. Cohen was always concerned about doing a lot of this kind of stuff in digital models. And so therefore we had some initial constraints that actually put a very multi-physics kinds of considerations on here to actually fly fast and fly far. And we also had a surrogate contractor, it was Altair. They were from the automotive industry. We used them because Mr. Cohen also wanted to actually have more commercial organizations that weren't hampered by, say, DoD processes. And so they built a multi-physics model, and we ended up coming up with a design that was like the Bell Eagle Eye, which is this tilt rotor here. Right? Our next effort was how to deal with things such as airworthiness, which is a stakeholder kind of concern. And that is, how do you get a flight clearance when you actually have these two capabilities that are interacting, even potential with humans, for actually allowing this to actually land on the air vehicle. And some of the airworthiness considerations is that it needs to be able to do this in 70-knot winds, and it needs to be able to come down at 25 feet per second. So that was another pilot. There's videos on that one too. And then the last one, again, which we'll talk about more tomorrow, but I'll briefly discuss this, is our cost model. All right, so for these measures, and like I said, if you listen to the prior talk, they came up with these 22 measures in these digital engineering success measure categories. And over the years of running the Skyzer pilot through 3 different phases, we captured 17 lessons learned. And so Tom McDermott asked me to, why don't I correlate those lessons learned with these measures? So I built a spreadsheet, and I put in numbers of 0, 3, 5, and 9 to actually correlate them, and I came out with the top 6. And so some of those are: establish the integrated modeling environment or digital engineering environment and the authoritative source of truth very early on in the program. Use digital engineering modeling methods that go beyond, and when you do that, that's how you get the digital sign-offs. Okay, we showed that it was technically feasible to do everything in models, and actually it eliminated some things that got subsumed by either the actual approach to modeling or the environment itself. And we demonstrated that we could actually apply this in a new collaborative approach with industry, and we actually had many meetings with industry on there. And some of the things that came out with the highest are improved traceability, okay, improved consistency because of the modeling methods, more automation, again, from the formalization of the models and the actual tools, and information access, improved information access in a collaborative environment. All right, so we also built a digital engineering roadmap. We actually have several of these. And this particular one, we took the digital engineering strategies as sort of like the prongs, and actually going towards fuller types of the future time in terms of things that we would actually want. And so these are like, if you're not familiar with them, cross-domain decision-making, authoritative source of truth, technical innovations, the collaborative environment, and digital engineering workforce. And as we go up, this is actually at the current state. So when I start this out right here, I'm going to talk about how model-based systems engineering actually strengthens systems engineering. I have a couple additional charts on that. The other thing was we used the OpenMBE from NASA JPL environment. It was actually had a bunch of additional kinds of things in it. Some things, for example, like DocGen, which I'll talk about in a minute here. We did establish a collaborative environment for to actually interact with people about decision making, and we use the digital engineering methods. So a process describes what, a method describes how, the particular artifacts. When we have those specific artifacts, that's what we can actually use to do digital sign-offs. For our Army work, we also have been leveraging what's called ontologies and semantic technologies to be able to create a repository to link system and mission models with discipline-specific models, such as those multi-physics kinds of models. And that's increasing the semantic integration, which will allow us to use automated reasoning to do things like AI and machine learning. And maybe you saw the prior talk with Dr. Mark Austin, because we had actually shown a little bit about how to integrate AI and machine learning to support a digital twin pattern. All right, so some of that I just actually talked about, but here are the different levels of abstraction that we're talking about, the operations, missions, and system level kinds of things. And what's important about MBSE is that it represents the structural analysis, the behavioral analysis, those interfaces as well as the requirements. And so we can actually have different modding methods to actually produce different artifacts at these different levels of abstraction. And again, using things like document generation, we can generate stakeholder relevant views from the models, so they potentially in a web browser, as we've done here. I'll show some examples of that. So therefore, they're not actually needing to navigate some of these system authoring kind of tools or MBSE authoring tools. Again, we set up the authoritative source of truth, provided collaborative access that would support the decision making. Okay, and again, from a workforce development point of view, we actually have taken these unclassified examples and we're trying to make them distro A, but they're already being used by Navigator to actually develop the workforce development. All right, so this actually goes into like the levels of abstraction again. So we have some stakeholder operational models that actually lead to capability-based models, such as the two different capabilities, the Skyzer and the ship. And then it comes down to the initial system model that is the functional logical views. And this is usually where someone like Navigator would stop and they would actually put those models and send them out in a request for proposal. This is why I talk about this as being more MBSE. It's connecting the information across the various subsystems. And then typically what will happen is the contractor will refine describing the particular physical allocations, such as, so maybe we were saying we need a landing gear to actually have this kind of spring mass damper for the UAV to touch the ship. The actual contractor may decide whether to make it a hydraulic or electric. And then we continue to do the decomposition. And this is more of the model-based engineering, and it's the discipline-specific models such as mechanical, electrical, or hardware, software, networking kind of models. So with that, I want to actually talk a little bit about requirements for more than artifacts. So let's go from one level of requirements to the next, because we know that that's what we actually do at each of those levels. Let's just assume that we're starting out here with the high level requirements. Pay attention to the blue boxes, the words, not so much the icons. So while we typically have gotten documents of the requirements in the past, which is just shell statements, and that's been in some ways sort of like not reflecting all of the analysis that went into creating those requirement shell statements. Today, we can also refine those and actually represent them in SysML models or model-based systems engineering models using requirement diagrams. And when we come from the higher level, we typically will also get a set of use cases. And so now we can actually start our analysis. So we could start with looking at the blocks and the parts. We could also talk about the interfaces or look at the interfaces between the parts. But as we refine the different use cases using different behavioral mechanisms, I'll talk about each one. We could do activity diagrams, which represent asynchronous processes, the control flow, and also the data flow, which could also help inform us about our interfaces. So that's why we actually may do behavioral and structural analysis in a more iterative kind of way. We could also refine use cases using, say, a sequence diagram. This is more common if you're doing something like software or communication systems. You could also refine a use case as a state machine. So for any block, say a block as large as the UAV itself, it may have states such as in the hangar, move out to the to take off, fly around, performance mission, land, go back to maintenance, and then back into the hangar. We can also model ilities, and I'll give an example such as a hazard analysis that's related to linking the information with other requirements. And we can also describe additional kinds of constraints on the actual what's called value properties, such as what is its weight, what's the cruise speed, max cruise speed, things of that nature. But what was much likely to happen in the future is linking these multi-physics kind of models, such as computational fluid dynamics or finite element analysis. And we've done that more with the Army. So what happens here is that while we might have actually had a mission requirement to have a cruise speed of 180 knots, once we actually look at the computational fluid dynamics to understand the airflow and the airframe from the weight that we actually have, we may actually find out that only, given the fact that I might have to have a hydraulic landing gear, it adds additional weight. And so therefore the max cruise speed could be 170 knots. And so that information get propagated back to the value properties. All right, so then the other thing too is that all this behavioral analysis is also going to be used in terms of verification planning. So in some ways you can quantify the number of tests that you might need to do or the different kind of analysis, but also it could be used in the execution. All of that analysis now can actually be used to create the next lower level set of requirements that can actually be traced back to the higher level set of requirements. And again, so you can see how this multi-physics stuff is actually used to actually have the value properties so that I can actually say the vehicle shall have a cruise speed of at least 170 knots. So that is how the behavioral and structural analysis can be created to create the next level of requirements. And what we demonstrated is putting all of these models as government furnished information along with the shall statements in part of the RFP, or the request for proposal. And NAVAIR also knows that from a contracting point of view, they're going to be able to discuss actually using these in a very different way. So therefore, if there's a concern that they don't understand the requirement, from the contractor point of view, they actually at least now have all of the analysis that went into doing it. Much better way of actually going about things. So therefore, you won't stop work necessarily to actually go back and reinvestigate what's going on with the requirements. Okay, so given that, so what does an authoritative source of truth look like? Okay, so we created what's called a full stack of models. And so we have the mission model, and we use this mechanism. It's a model import called project uses in the Cameo tool that we use. And it actually includes the mission model so that actually it can see and trace information from the launch recovery system to the mission model. So let's talk about a scenario here in a minute where the launch recovery system has to actually change, and they actually need to change a constraint in the mission model. Now, because the system model and the actual contractor model actually includes all the way up to the mission model, that particular change is actually visible. That's what the authoritative source of truth is helping us do. And these are actually distributed models. I'll talk about where these would be located and why it's called an authoritative source, not a single source. Now, there are at least 3 types of reference models. The first one is called a process model. So this was NAVAIR created this NAVAIR systems engineering method. It's a hybrid method. It includes some other standard like OSM and some features from other people such as Delegati and Welkins, and so therefore it's a hybrid of things, but it actually describes the specific processes, but also the artifacts. All right, and then there's another kind of models, which we'll refer to as stakeholder analysis models. These are also reference models. And so, for example, the airworthiness model is from MIL Standard 516C. And so therefore, it's a superset of all things that might be needed for doing airworthiness. But when we do it, we create a specific instance of it that actually links to, using this project uses mechanism, links to the full stack of technical models so that it includes the airworthiness criteria that's actually in the technical stack of models, not necessarily everything that's here. Same thing has actually occurred for cost. And again, we will go through this tomorrow. So now let's go back to our scenario again. So let's suppose that we had a change, and maybe it was that we basically had to add a hydraulic because we basically couldn't actually land on the ship at 25 feet per second descent with the electrical model. Okay, so now all of a sudden, that means that we might need a new verification criteria, which also means that we need a new test. So now, because the cost model includes all those other models, the potential cost from even adding the constraint, adding an additional test for the hydraulic model can be actually looked at from a what-if analysis even prior to actually going further. And we could even go back and make a question whether the particular requirement that's necessary from the launch recovery system, does it need to be made or not? Okay, so therefore it's helping the acquisition folks have more information to actually and understand the dependency of all the information to support decision-making about cost and program kind of options. Now, as another example of an automation, another thing that we did, so there's what's called cost equations, which are equations that have been captured over time based on different methodologies. And this, again, will be talked about tomorrow. And so what we created is a surrogate set of equations that are close. They might have come from historical information, like different reports. But when we actually make a source selection and actually pick a particular contractor, NAVAIR has different information. And so therefore, they can actually tailor those cost equations based on the actual contractor that actually got selected, and or they can actually trade off different ones. And we came up with a mechanism to automatically substitute in various different kind of cost equations. Okay, and so now for my last kind of reference model, and again, this is where I'm believing that there is ROI that people just haven't seen it yet. So, so what we have here is, I call these reference models, they were probably called reference architectures, but they are actually generalizations from prior designs. And so therefore, when we actually start a new Skyzer or a new UAV, we might actually start out with a UAV reference model and have a 60% solution already as we move forward. But also notice that there may also be reference models for the missions. So we can actually reuse those types of things. So we should be able to leverage these various different kind of reference models to accelerate the development of what we're actually doing. Okay, so now that's the models. Now let me talk about the actual tooling that we actually put in place for our program and what was that used at NavAir. So on the government side, we did actually use, again, the No Magic products. We had the repository, which is called Teamwork Cloud. We also have another repository that's part of the OpenMBE deployment, which is called the Model Management System, as well as the View Editor, which is a way to actually view models that have been generated from DocGen. And this particular thing, we actually had the surrogate contractor that was set up that might also have additional multi-physics kind of models, such as these. And we simulated another thing with Stevens. But let me go through a scenario. So let's suppose that the contractor now determines, after it's done some analysis, that an endurance of 50 hours with a threshold of 2 is not possible under some weight and environmental situations. Now they can actually go back up into the View Editor and edit the particular thing. And I'm going to show an example in a minute. Edit the threshold of 2 and actually add a link and say in a comment saying that 2 is not possible. It has to be at least 3.5. And so therefore now the subject matter expert from NavAir could come in, hyperlink through into the environment, given that they had credentials or authentication mechanisms to do it. Look at the analysis directly in the analysis tool and say, oh, I see. Then they could go back, create a branch. This is like model management. They could actually change the value from 2 to 4, have a review, do a digital sign-off, and then merge that particular branch back into the master branch, or sometimes referred to as the trunk. So that's the operational scenario. We actually have videos on actually doing that. But let me talk about another scenario. So let's just suppose this is the Joint Strike Fighter program. Okay, so this is the government side, and we have Lockheed, who's the contractor for JSF. But for the helmet, we can have actually Rockwell. So the government has a relationship with Rockwell and with Lockheed, but Lockheed also has a relationship with Rockwell. And so that's why this is not a hierarchy. This is a graph. This is like the internet. And that is where things would be moving in terms of it's a distributed set of nodes that represents the authoritative source of truth. And we need to actually have the tooling. And in contracts going forward, it'll be necessary for the government to actually ask for ability to get into the contractor's models, because we're not going to actually replicate all the things that are on the contractor side. We will actually be bringing back information such as metadata. In other words, when they really determine, for example, that the threshold is 4, they're bringing metadata back to what we have. So therefore, when we create requirements, they'll be based on the metadata that's actually propagated back from these higher level fidelity kind of models. Right, so DocGen is a capability that uses this model development kit that's a plugin into the Cameo. And the reason why this was created is that the founder of OpenMB, Chris Delp from NASA JPL, said, look, subject matter experts are not going to be navigating what's called a containment tree. It's the way that you look at stuff. So therefore, they create a mechanism that actually gets plugged in. It creates a set of views that actually will automatically generate. It'll select the different object models and actually render that in a view editor. But also, as I just talked about, we can actually edit in here, and that's how the edits actually go back and change specific values of objects. And so they created at the time this model management repository because the traditional repositories were based off of files. And what we want to do is we want to actually be able to change information down to the single object, just like that example that I had of changing the threshold from a value of 2 to 4. So that's how that was used. And it generates a hierarchy, okay, and then I'll talk about it in a minute here. But so for our Skyzer model, we use the NAVSEM process, okay, and it describes the different kinds of process guidelines, but it also describes specific artifacts that I'm going to talk about in a minute here. Describes specific ones for the mission context in this first set of information. It also defines the functional logical views for the Skyzer system. Now, while the NavAir have defined this so that it could actually have a physical information such as this specific engine or this specific radio, we actually showed in our Skyzer models that of actually how to do this second part as the contractor RFP response. And so with that, one of the things that we were able to do is that because we knew these specific artifacts, such an operational use case, we came up with the concept, and this is from Dr. Benjamin Cruz, who was on our team, to create a digital sign-off mechanism, a very generic kind of mechanism, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So how does DocGen View and Viewpoint work? Well, there's a document structure that gets created, and we describe a set of views, okay, and we can expose a model element. So the person that is on the development side knows where they're actually building these things, understands the structure that they're making of the model, but the subject matter expert can actually in advance say that I would like to see these different kinds of views come out. Now, a viewpoint is it's like a little program that basically grabs the information out of the exposed information and then actually places it at that position in the model. So for example, here's an example. So there is that exact same hierarchical structure. Here is the actual selected operational use case, and we have a template-based mechanism that we can actually use to, if we can enable edits, if you have the permissions, you can actually approve it and have the approver. It's template-based, so we can actually have different numbers of people. We could also have different kinds of fields to comment or to even potentially say that it's 75% complete because I believe that it's like that's not going to change. Okay, here's another example, and this one again is for a fault tree. I like to use this example for another couple of teaching reasons anyway. So a fault tree is part of hazard analysis. So at the top of the tree is a type of a hazard, and if it manifests, it could actually result in a mishap. So what we do is we describe these intermediate nodes down to the bottom nodes, which are called basic events. And so a basic event is if it manifests and it's not mitigated or captured, then the hazard could result. And so what we do is that we want to create requirements, mitigation requirements to be attached to these. And this is why I like requirements in the model, because we can actually have the association with the particular modeling artifact, but also notice that these are not derived from any other thing than from the hazard analysis. So therefore, that's how they're coming into play. So now on this particular case, because it's fault tree or hazard analysis, we use the standard risk cube. And so we can see that we can actually use probability and impact as actually the measures that are in this particular model. Now, in this particular case, we simulated, our reviewer, Adam, said, we're going to reject this one because we think that there's a missing basic event over here. And so this was another thing where we actually talked about some automation that we demonstrated. So one of the concerns from one of the subject matter experts was, well, what happens if I did a sign off, I approved it, but then the model changed for some reason? Well, we determined that we can automatically detect if a artifact, a diagram, for example, is changed after the particular digital sign off. And so therefore we either set it back to TBD or notify the actual reviewer so that they can repeat the process. But notice in this particular case also, this was rejected. So not only can we do it for the approved things, but so now suppose someone actually, it said it was rejected, they come back, they make the change, they add the new one. Now it can also be notified to actually go back and do this review. And this maps back to another desire that Mr. Cohen had, which was he wanted to have continuous asynchronous process or reviews to actually understand the maturing design. And he also called it a design review a day. All right, then the next thing we did was to actually show how you can actually embed a digital sign-off based on what's called the technical evaluation criteria. It's in a section in the government called Section L, and normally it's a spreadsheet. But what we did is we had an embedded within the contractor RFP response, and then we had our subject matter expert, Don Polakovich, who at the time had not used a SysML authoring tool, nor had he actually taken any courses in SysML, but it just shows that he had the ability to actually read all this model, and he actually performed the source selection technical evaluation criteria directly in the model. All right, so with that, are we done? No, we're not necessarily done. There's quite a bit more to be discussed in terms of these digital sign-offs, including another concept that was actually discussed, and it was particularly relevant during this COVID shutdown here, which is that we were showing how we were doing continuous kind of reviews versus having these monolithic reviews at the preliminary design review or critical design review. And we started to work this concept of a baseline progress measures, and we should still continue it, which is that if we have all these measures and these metrics from the digital sign-offs, can we come up with a way to have a quantitative representation of the maturity of the design as it continues throughout the entire day? And so if somebody wants to actually see a video on actually how these things are actually done, there's actually a video right here. Right, so that now my one slide that I can actually use for the Army. So this is the full stack of models for the Army. So what we have here is they have reference architectures, and we have digital ontologies for the domains that they're concerned about. Okay, and so then we have mission models that end up having measures and metrics like key performance parameters or measures of effectiveness. We have used the Unity gaming engine to do graphical ConOps, to do a type of visual validation of our deeper analysis that's done. We have system models, we have analysis models that also, again, they basically hold the metadata from these higher level set of computational fluid dynamics or finite element analysis models. Now, the difference between the Army and the Navy is that the Army, because they really need to actually create prototypes, go all the way down to the bottom here. So we end up having CFD, computational fluid dynamics, finite element analysis, and six degree of freedom, the flight path it would take. We actually use the high fidelity 6 degree of freedom with our graphical ConOps to do a type of a validation and calibration for our sponsors. And again, we still use View Editor, and the digital sign-offs are possible in this particular stack. So this model is that this is the system of design and analysis, and here's the tools that are around it on the outside, which is that's the designing system, if you will. And with that, I will take some questions.
Mark, we actually have a couple of questions here from Stephanie. First one, for incorporation of the physics-based models into the full stack and capturing the design of experiments or other trait studies that you're doing, are you utilizing something like Model-Centric for simulation and execution? Okay, here's Model-Centric right here. So the answer is that yes, we actually we have about 7 or 8 applications, 2 on NavAir side, and I think about 5 or 6 for the Army. And if you go to the Model-Centric Phoenix Integration website, you can go back and maybe it's around 2018 or 2019, we actually talk about 5 use cases where we use the Model-Centric capabilities. Thank you. And her second question is, are you using the OpenMBE MMS as your PLM implementation, the way other industries or agencies might be using something like Windchill or Teamcenter or Aris? Okay, so in some ways we started to, but we were actually pushed, I guess, away from that. It's like our sponsors want us to use commercial tools. So while they understand the need to potentially have an open ecosystem, which is the way that 2 industry organizations put it, okay, which they're part of the OpenMB group, the Google group that actually meets every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, every other week for the community group. But yes, they basically, it would really work very nicely and we could use that, but we are not using MMS as much as we did in the beginning because it's open source and there's some concerns about using open source tools now. And I'm really looking forward to the new version of MMS 2 coming out. Mark, appreciate it. And with that, we have 2 minutes before our next presenter presents. So if you'd like to switch sessions or stay on. Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, and so, well, if I have 2 minutes, I just want to be able to pull up. I was going to just show somebody. So here is like one of the many different models that we actually have. Like, and here's one of our test models to actually show the different kinds of information. But because I have the time, this just shows that if you wanted to do a digital sign-off, you can enable edits and actually come over here and actually touch this particular thing and actually make the change to the thing and then save it. And so that's the approach that the digital sign-offs would actually work. So this is an example of like the Skyzer system model. So not only can it be, in the actual model, okay, which here is the actual Skyzer system model, and this is the DocGen representation of the view and viewpoint hierarchy that actually produced that model. Thank you, Mark. Another question actually from Mimi, a bit of a pivot, but pulling a thread from your morning plenary session yesterday. Did you find any similar culture obstacles between your 2 sponsor groups when you're trying to implement this? Well, I mean, see, we're dealing with very technical people usually. And so I would say no. I would say that in the beginning, a lot of people were both skeptical, okay? But I mean, that's what I think what we did, one thing that was very different, I think, about some of the kind of CERC research that we've done that may be different from other organizations where they get the funding and they do some reports and stuff, is that we always have working sessions. So we have working sessions sometimes bi-weekly. I mean, we meet a lot with them. And what happens is then the sponsors
and all the stakeholders that are involved become more immersed. And actually, when we're actually doing work, we're not actually just using our own researchers that are in the collaboration. We're actually using the external environment. So our weekly meeting that we used to have for say our Skyzer meeting, I mean, it had sometimes had 30 different people in there, from the external organizations, and similar kinds of things are being done with the Army. So I think it's we're in a new state where if you actually have a lot of interaction with the people, that actually there becomes we're working together and they really understand that, and so therefore there's much more learning, and so therefore the technology transfer is happening on a continuous basis. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Again, appreciate your presentation today and all the updates. Good work. And with